One sunny autumn day, Eric Johnson, a 35-year-old African-American, went for a walk around his neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago. Eric worked as a lawyer and always valued the moments when he could escape the hustle and bustle of his profession by simply walking outdoors. He walked through the park, enjoying the beauty of the trees, the autumn colors, and thinking about the upcoming case he needed to prepare for. On the other side of the park stood Patrol Officer John Hanson, who had just started his shift. John had been on the force for 10 years and often thought he knew the city like the back of his hand. However, he had a preconceived notion, as did many of his co-workers. When he saw Eric walking calmly down the alley, he had an instant suspicion. A thought flashed through John's mind. This guy looks out of place. Something's not right here. The officer decided to observe Eric, even though there was no reason to be suspicious. Eric noticed John watching him and inwardly tensed. He knew that look all too well, the look that said, "You're guilty." Even if you didn't do anything, he didn't want conflict, but he knew he might soon be approached with questions. And his premonition was justified. "Good afternoon," John said, coming closer, his tone friendly but his eyes wary. "Good afternoon," Eric replied calmly. "What are you doing here?" John asked, looking Eric over from top to bottom. "Just taking a walk." Eric tried to remain calm, though he was already growing irritated inside. John felt that his words sounded suspicious. He had always trusted his intuition, and now he decided to go further. "Can I see your ID?" Eric froze. He knew he didn't have to show ID just for simply strolling in a public place, but he also knew that refusing could complicate the situation. Inwardly sighing, he decided to ask anyway. "Did I break some law? Why are you stopping me?" John tensed up. He had not expected such an answer. Thoughts began to swarm in his head. Why doesn't he want to show his ID? Maybe he's hiding something at this point. Professional automatism mixed with personal prejudice began to appear in his actions. "If you don't show your papers, I'll be forced to detain you," he said sharply, putting his hand on his gun holster. Eric felt the tension in his body reach a peak. At times like this, he remembered his youth, when he had been stopped more than once for unreasonable reasons just because of the color of his skin. He was ready to defend his rights, but he knew that if things got out of hand. "Okay, here's my ID," he said calmly, trying not to show irritation. John quickly grabbed the ID, but when he saw that Eric was an attorney with over a decade of experience, his face tensed. The officer sensed the situation was more complicated than he thought. This wasn't just some random person who might get scared and submit to the authorities, but now it was too late to back down. John, without realizing it himself, had gone down the path of justifying his prejudiced actions. "Stand up, please, and follow me to the car," John ordered without removing his hand from his holster. Eric looked at him tiredly, realizing that the officer was acting under the influence of bias. He knew that his arrest hardly had any legal basis. However, instead of resisting, he decided to follow John, not out of fear, but because he knew that he would be proven right, albeit later. When they arrived at the station, Eric was seated in an interrogation room. A few minutes later, Captain Catherine Baker entered the room, a stern but fair woman who was known for her attention to detail and her pursuit of the truth. "Officer Hanson," she began, looking at John with barely concealed disappointment, "you detained this man on what grounds?" John hesitated. He couldn't cite any concrete evidence other than his own hunches and suspicions. Captain Baker took Eric's ID card and read it aloud. "Eric Johnson, an attorney with 20 years of experience. You know, Officer Hanson, this man wasn't just walking in the park. He has as much right to be there as anyone else. What I need to know is, did you have probable cause to detain him?" John felt the ground go from under his feet. He wanted to object, but all he could say sounded like an excuse for his own prejudices. Catherine Baker watched his reaction carefully. "You do realize that your actions may qualify as prejudicial," the captain continued. "There should be no place for such actions in the police force." Eric, who had been sitting silent all this time, finally spoke. "Captain Baker, I don't want to escalate the situation. I just want justice. This isn't the first time I've been pulled over for no reason. And I'm sure it won't be the last. But perhaps if something changes now, there will be fewer incidents like this. Catherine nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation. Officer Hansen, she began with a firmness in her voice. You're going to need additional training on racial bias and civil rights. I will also schedule a temporary review of your performance. John nodded, realizing that his career was now in jeopardy. He had thought he was only doing his job, but now he realized he had made a serious mistake. After Eric was released, he stayed in the office with the captain for a few minutes. You realize I don't want to make a show of this, Eric said, looking her straight in the eye. I just need to make sure incidents like this don't happen again, not just for me, but for others. Captain Baker sighed. I understand, Mr. Johnson. I promise you that we will take action. This incident will not go without consequences. Eric nodded and stood up, getting ready to leave. Thank you, Captain, he said one last time. I hope your word will make a difference. When Eric left the station, John was left all alone. He thought about how one prejudicial act could ruin not only his career but also his self-image. That day changed him forever. Several weeks had passed. The police department began internal reviews and additional training for officers related to citizen bias. John went through the training, gradually realizing how deeply his own biases were affecting his job. Eric continued his career as an attorney, but that incident left a bitter aftertaste in his soul. He knew that one incident couldn't completely change the system, but he hoped that at least for someone like John, that day would be the beginning of change. In the fall, Eric walked through the same park again as before, but now with a lightness of heart.